Welcome to the Business Talk podcast. I am your host Deepak from India. Today we have the privilege of welcoming Dr. Samir Chopra, Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at Brooklyn College of the City, University of New York, to our podcast. Dr. Samir Chopra is a philosopher and author of several books, including A Legal Theory for Autonomous Artificial Agents, co-authored with Professor Lawrence White. He regularly writes at samirchopra.com and contributes essays at venues such as The Nation, the Los Angeles Review of Books, and Jacobin. As a philosophical counselor certified by the American Philosophical Practitioners Association, Dr. Chopra works with individuals seeking clarity about self-knowledge, happiness, love, meaningful work, and how to live well, drawing on a rich philosophical tradition that reflects deeply on anxiety, grief, and depression. Through sustained dialogical inquiry, and he invites people to examine who they are and who they wish to become, not by prescribing a single path, but by helping them discover their own way forward. In today's episode, Dr. Samir Chopra shares key insights from his acclaimed book, Anxiety, a Philosophical Guide, exploring how philosophy can help us be less anxious about anxiety by recognizing it as an essential part of the human experience. It's my pleasure to now welcome Dr. Samir Chopra to the conversation. Dr. Chopra, we are deeply honored by your presence and grateful for your time with us today.
Thanks very much for having me on. Deepak. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
Thank you. Professor, you argue that anxiety isn't always or only a medical condition. How do you think the modern tendency to pathologize and medicate anxiety has changed our relationship with this fundamental human experience? And what are we potentially losing in that process?
Deepak, that's a very good question. And what I would say is that the modern tendency to perhaps over-medicalize or over-medicate conditions that are classified as mental illnesses or mental health problems or pathologies, with respect to anxiety, has a very particular consequence. One is that, as I will describe later in this talk, and I'm sure this will come up, I consider anxiety to be kind of a constitutive part of the human condition. It's something that no human being can actually avoid. And we can get into that part of the conversation later. But what I would say is that if we are always medicating anxiety, taking pharmaceutical prescriptions for it, we might be missing out on one of the most important relationships that we can have with anxiety, which is that we should be reflecting on anxiety. We should be thinking about anxiety. We should be trying to understand our particular version of anxiety. And what I mean by that is anxiety is universal to human beings. I would say that a creature like us, which has the existential conditions that it does, which is that it lives in time, that this time is finite. This creature is conscious that this time is finite. For instance, we could have been creatures who live in time, in finite time, but don't know that this time is finite. In our case, we are conscious of the fact that this time is finite. Moreover, we are curious creatures. We wish to know what lies ahead of us in the future, but we are limited creatures. That is, we cannot do, frankly speaking, much about what lies in the future. There are some actions we can take to direct the path of our futures, but there is no perfect control that we can exercise over our futures. So I put it to you that a creature which is conscious, which lives in time, which is aware that its time is finite, which is curious about the future, and yet is powerless to prevent certain kinds of futures from coming about, will always be anxious. Now, this kind of creature, which is a human being, is in a very peculiar position. It is bound to be anxious by virtue of these existential conditions. But every creature, every human being is born with a particular history and at a particular point in time, at a particular socio-economic, cultural location. Now, what this means is that every human being suffers a kind of what I would call a universal existential anxiety. But that universal existential anxiety takes on a very distinctive shape given the life that it's living, right? So, for example, you and I live in different countries. We have different backgrounds. There is a certain similarity in our backgrounds. For instance, we both are of Indian origin, for instance. But in this sense, the particulars of our life ensure that the unique species of anxiety that I will suffer has a particular meaning and a significance for me, which I should be able to reflect upon and try to understand why I, Samir, feel anxious in these particular ways. My anxiety is not yours. Your anxiety is not mine. We have very distinctive species of anxiety. And I think one of the problems is that if we try to medicate ourselves, and I wish to clarify, I don't mean medication per se, but I mean over medication. One is that we treat all kinds of worried, stressful, panicky, nervous reactions to the future, which are quite normal given the complicated lives that we lead. If we over medicate, if we over diagnose anxiety, and I would say this is a particularly pernicious feature of the modern era, that we tend to overdiagnose mental illness, that we tend to treat reactions to the world, which are, I would say, in some ways rational or even justified, might be treated as mental illnesses or mental pathologies because the surrounding culture is unable to accommodate our particular reactions to these conditions that we live in. And when we get into the material aspects of anxiety, this problem will come up again. So what we might be doing by over medicating or over diagnosing is that we might be missing out on opportunities for reflection. Why do I, Samir, feel anxious in this particular way? If I was to reflect on this anxiety, I might be able to reflect on my particular history. For example, there are distinctive events in my history that make me anxious quite in the way that I am. For example, in my book, I talk about the early deaths of my parents, right? Now, within particular cultural situations, the death of parents is, I mean, for anybody, the death of parents is a significant event. But in my case, my parents passed away when I was young. This is something distinctive about me. They had a particular cultural location in my understanding of what my relationship to my parents is. I'm a migrant. I I actually, came to this country when I was 20 years old. All these aspects of my history, the fact that I have a child who I worry about very much, my economic circumstances are in a particular way. These kinds of things can make me reflect on why I am anxious about the future in the way that I am. So I would say that reflecting on my own anxiety can make me think about what my values are, what my commitments are, what are the things that I consider truly valuable and precious, which I would be afraid to lose. These kinds of reflections, the kind of self knowledge that we can get from this kind of reflection, is something that I think we could miss out on if we overdiagnose and over medicate ourselves.
Dr. Chopra, many philosophers you discuss from the Buddha to Heidegger views anxiety as inevitable and inseparable from existence itself. Can you
Right.
walk us through why anxiety might actually be essential to human being or being human rather than something to eliminate?
Well, I think part of that answer is contained in what I just said to your first question, right? That there are existential conditions that we live under which make us, I would say, essentially anxious, or I would say that it makes anxiety constitutive in some ways, or it makes it a kind of an ineliminable component of the human condition. You mentioned the Buddha and you mentioned Heidegger, and I would say the Buddha is a very good example of this. He knows, or he recognizes that human beings have finite existence. He recognizes that human beings are caught up in a certain kind of misunderstanding of their role, of who they are, or what they are. And as a result of this, we remain perpetually dissatisfied with existence, right? Now, I would say that the existential conditions of finiteness, our knowledge of death, our knowledge that in some sense, no matter what we do, that life projects will remain unfulfilled, that we cannot do anything to prevent harm to the ones that we love. These kinds of things make, I would say, anxiety essential, and it makes it ever more important that we think about what our relationship should be to something that we cannot get rid of. Now, I would say that whenever we find ourselves in a problematic situation, there are only really three options that are available to us. One is escape, right? That we leave the problematic situation that I find myself in. I will get away from here. I will run away from here, right? There is a hole in the roof. Water is coming through the roof. I must escape, right? So I leave this particular place. The second option that we have is what I would call activism, that we do something about it, right? So I go get tools, I get some wood, I start to fix the hole in the roof, right? Now, if neither of these options is available to me, if neither of these options is available to me, I mean, I could escape from this life. I could choose to terminate my life or, become a hermit or something like that. But even that, even becoming a hermit will not get rid of some anxieties. And if there's nothing I can do about it, for example, there's nothing I can do about the finiteness of time, and I'm not a god, so I cannot become omniscient and suddenly know what lies in the future. And because I'm not God, neither am I omnipotent. I don't have infinite powers so that I can affect the course of my future. Then I would say we only have one option left to us. And that option is to try to understand or try to reinterpret the situation that I'm in, right? And I think if we come to regard anxiety as something which is a feature of human existence, which is an aspect of human existence, rather than a pimple, a wart, or a blemish, or an imperfection that needs to be removed somehow, then I think we might have a better relationship to the presence of anxiety in our lives. If something is not going to go away from our lives, then I think there is a demand upon us that we understand it differently. It is sometimes said that all of therapy is a way to get us to reconstrue that which cannot be altered. And I would say anxiety is one of those things. If it is a part of the human condition, we should try to understand it, try to understand what our anxiety means, and try to come to a different relationship with it and find ways of living with it as opposed to running away from it. Because I would think that the act of running away from something which cannot be escaped from is actually a guarantee of further misery, further unhappiness, and further discomfort.
Very insightful. Professor, your book blends memory with philosophy. How did your own struggles with serious anxiety shape your philosophical inquiry? And at what point did you realize that philosophy itself might offer something that medication alone couldn't?
Deepak, that's a very good question. As I've mentioned in my introductory remarks, I've had my own struggles with anxiety following the premature deaths of my parents. I was in psychotherapy for 5 years, and what I came to discover through that period was that I had always been anxious, right? At some level, even when I was a child, even before my parents had passed away, I had been an anxious person. And in some ways, this was like other human beings. And I would say I was undergoing psychotherapy at the same time that I was studying philosophy. And in fact, I began my philosophical studies after my mother passed away from cancer when I was 26 years old. Her death was particularly painful and agonizing, as often people who suffer from cancer do. And what I found was that there was a certain kind of terrifying, eventuality that had taken place in my life, which is that my parents, who were a certain kind of guarantor of meaning and purpose in my life, had vanished, right? There was a kind of pillar or a foundation of my existence which had crumbled. And what I found at that time was that philosophy, reading philosophy, thinking about its claims, thinking about what its doctrines said about existence and my place within it, was actually a source of comfort to me. Now, when I say comfort, I don't mean to say it provided me immediate relief from anxiety, but it helped me understand why I felt the way I did, why I was bereft in the way that I was, and what this meant for the kind of life that I could live. I also came to understand through philosophy that while I might have imagined at one time that I was, picked out for punishment in some way, like there was some kind of curse that was upon me, once I came to understand the role of anxiety in the human condition, I also came to understand that there was nothing, in some sense, particularly distinctive about me. I had not been picked out for punishment by the cosmos. There was a kind of place that I occupied. There were certain conditions of life. Happiness was not a guarantee. And in fact, I would say that even, satisfaction or contentment wasn't a guarantee, that the challenges of life were to find meaning and purpose within it, even if life was difficult, uncomfortable, and often unhappy. And I think this kind of reconciliation this kind of reconciliation with what existence actually entailed was something that I found coming from philosophy, and I didn't think I would find it in pharmaceutical medication. I've actually never taken pharmaceutical medication. I have, however, struggled with what people sometimes euphemistically describe as self-medication. Maybe I drank too much or something like that. But I would say that my struggles with it were in a way proceeding as I was undertaking my doctoral studies. I actually began my PhD in philosophy the same year that my mother passed away. And I found that those 7 years were a real struggle in some ways. But as I finished my PhD, as I went into my postdoctoral studies, as I became a professor of philosophy, the various philosophical texts that I worked through, that I read, that I reflected on, that I often discussed with my students in my classrooms, that those discussions, those readings, those reflections were very useful in helping me come to grips with my anxiety and also helping me accept that anxiety was going to be a part of my life. And that rather than running away from it, I would do better to turn around, to confront it, and to learn to live with it.
Professor Kierkegaard in the existentialist seems central to your argument. What do you think existentialism uniquely offers us in understanding anxiety that other philosophical traditions don't?
Um, Deepak, very good question. There are four, as philosophical traditions that I talk about in my book, and existential certainly takes a very prominent role in that. I discussed four existentialist philosophers in there. Kierkegaard is, of course, prominent amongst them, just because he's so often regarded as the founder of what we consider modern existentialism. And I would say philosophers like Sartre and Heidegger have borrowed a great deal from Kierkegaard. It's quite visible in the writings of Sartre and Heidegger that they borrowed a great deal from him. I would say more generally, just referring to existentialism's central claims, I think what it offers us is, I think, two or three things. First is it makes us think about philosophical doctrines not in terms necessarily of the content of doctrines, but it helps us think about who is philosophizing, right? The philosopher themselves, their subjective experiences, which is one of the reasons that existentialism has such an overlap with literature or with, say, phenomenology, for instance, right? This emphasis on one's lived experience, one's conscious experience. It places a great deal of importance on one's subjective understanding of the world, the unique meaning that particular events of the world can have in us. For us, for example, you and I might witness the same physical event and yet understand it very differently because of our subjective understanding of what is happening, right? Existentialism also brings us face to face with these kinds of existential conditions that I talked about before, right? That time is finite, that we are conscious of the finiteness of time, or as Heidegger points out, that we are being towards death, we are aware of this death. And Kierkegaard brings us into contact with the notion that our future is undetermined, that we have a choice to make in bringing this future about. And in so doing, not only are we making the future real, we are also bringing ourself into being. He makes us aware of our capacities, of the choices that we have. There's this famous example that Kierkegaard gives us of us experiencing vertigo when we are standing at a cliff, looking out into a chasm over a waterfall. And I look down into these deep, scary depths. And I'm terrified of this height, right? I'm terrified of this height. I don't want to go close to the edge. And yet I know I could. If I wanted, I could step up to the edge. I could step off, right? I could, as it were, terminate my existence. This is a choice. This is a power that I have. That power is the power to do good, to do bad. It helps us understand that this unrealized future that lies ahead of me, this is not just going to come into shape because of other people or other forces bringing it about, that I have a role to make the previously undetermined, to make it concrete. When I realize this, I think this is a genuinely terrifying prospect, because I come to realize that this uncertainty I have in the world, I can make it certain by taking actions, but then I am responsible for the consequences of the actions. So I think there is something morally interesting about the fact to make oneself the author of one's existence, but to also take responsibility for those actions, right? If I'm bringing this future about and it's my choices that are doing so, then I must step forward bravely, perhaps courageously, and say that whatever happens, I stand by it because these are my actions and my choices. So I think there is an emphasis on agency, choice, freedom, on coming face to face unflinchingly with the bare facts of existence. Existentialism is often associated with its atheistic components. Kierkegaard himself was a existentialist Christian himself who believed that faith had a very important role to play in this. He identified anxiety with the notion that I could do sin, right? That I could commit a sin. It's the feeling that Adam had before he bit into the apple, right? That I might be doing something wrong, but I can do it, and I did it, right? So, this notion, that feeling right before I take an action, I am the one deciding to do this, and I will be the one who will bear the consequences. This reflection on our freedom, our agency, and our responsibility, I think this is something that existentialism brings us into contact with. And I think this is one of the most salutary aspects of that particular school of thought.
Fantastic, Dr. Chopra. Professor, you draw on Marx and Marquis to examine how poverty and material conditions can intensify anxiety. How do we reconcile the idea that anxiety is universal with the reality that socio-economic inequality makes some people significantly more anxious than others?
Very good question, Deepak. Now, Deepak, you mentioned Marx and Marcuse, both of whom feature in my chapter on anxiety and the material. Now, Marcuse himself famously criticized Jean-Paul Sartre's writing on existentialism, and his argument was that existentialism is treating anxiety as an ontological feature of existence, something that we can do nothing about. Now, of course, Marcuse as a social theorist and Marx himself as a social theorist, they're both aware of the fact that our material conditions can make us significantly anxious, right? And notice that if we just take anxiety to be an inseparable part of human existence, it has a certain very interesting political consequence. It lets certain kinds of forces off the hook, right? You and I are members of societies and cultures which are dominated by, in fact, all of us today living in this modern world, we are dominated by two very large forces, finance and technology. These affect the material conditions of our lives. People occupy very differing positions on the economic spectrum, right? Some people have food, clothing, and shelter, other people don't. Even those that have food, clothing, and shelter are often insecure and anxious because they do not know what their future holds for them. As Marx pointed out, we frequently grow up alienated and, as it were, cut out from the world because we have lost the appropriate relationship to our work, to our labor, to the products we produce. And in fact, we have commodified relationships. We treat human relationships and evaluate them in terms of their economic value. This is a recipe for alienation and anxiety, this constant source of worry. Where will my next meal come from? Where will my children go to school? Will I have enough money for medical treatment? These are nagging worries that completely cloud our future, and I would say actually reduce the amount of freedom that we feel. So I would say the relationship between existentialist accounts of anxiety and materialist accounts of anxiety is, I think, the following. I think everybody, all human beings, are sufferers. I would say fellow sufferers. You and I are united by this bond of being fellow sufferers of anxiety. But in our particular life, this particular seed takes form in its own distinctive way, depending upon our material conditions, right? So, which is why I live a comfortable existence here in the United States. I have a house, I have a home, I live in a beautiful part of the country, but I am racked by anxiety in many different ways. I have to be honest, I'm financially anxious in certain ways because this country has, interesting politics and interesting economic, I would say, convolutions going on right now. So are other people in the world. All of us are insecure about what effect climate change might have on our futures, right? But my particular brand and species of anxiety is unique. Now, notice also that if all our material conditions were taken care of, I would not stop being anxious. The chairman of Amazon, this is my favorite example, Jeff Bezos, he might be worth several, I don't know, 70, 80, hundreds of billions of dollars, but he cannot prevent certain things from happening in his life. Unless he acquires superhuman powers, he will not be immortal. Moreover, he cannot stop sickness, disease, and death affecting his loved ones. As a middle aged man, he will continue to receive news that those he went to high school and college with are getting sick and dying. He cannot, as it were, despite all his money, hold back the inevitable fate of every single human being. I would say, in that sense, the Buddha was onto something very deep. Material attainment might, as it were, relieve temporary discomfort, but it is not going to get rid of what the Buddha called dukkha, dissatisfaction with existence. If I'm always perennially grasping, if I'm always perennially seeking, if I'm always perennially worried about the status of my material goods, my cars, my houses, my stock balances, then even material comfort will not bring me any closer to an anxiety free existence. So I think different people will have different kinds of anxiety. They will have different amounts of anxiety. And in many cases, our material anxiety can be improved by improving our material conditions, but it will not eradicate it. So I think so I think there is an interesting interaction between the existentialist view and the materialist view, which is I think that the materialist view is right in some ways to criticize the existentialist view, right? Saying that, hey, you're not just feeling anxious just because you're free. You're feeling anxious because your freedom has been taken away from you by particular social, political, economic, and cultural arrangements. So we need to be active about it. We need to be politically engaged. We need to change the world around us to improve its material conditions. The Buddha committed us to the notion of interdependent arising, right? That we suffering in one place means suffering for me as well. All human beings, all living creatures are connected, right? I might be a very happy person living in this house, but if 2 miles away from me, there is someone who is deeply unhappy, who is having fights with their family, that same person could be the cause of my misfortunes tomorrow. So, my being alone, happy, and isolated in my wonderful walled off garden is no guarantee that I will be insured from the misfortunes of those around me, right? So, I think we're all anxious, but we're anxious in our distinctive ways. Material conditions can improve and diminish anxiety to a certain extent, but it will never go to zero in that sense.
Professor, Buddhism appears prominently in your philosophical framework. How does the Buddhist approach to anxiety differ from Western philosophical traditions? And what unique insights does it offer for managing our relationship with anxiety?
Very good question, Deepak. The Buddha committed us to, uh, I would say, a series of very simple and powerful truths. And I think his insights that are visible in these truths, they mark out Buddhism as a way of thinking about human happiness and human satisfaction in a manner that is quite distinct from Western traditions. He doesn't think that it's a matter of improving external conditions. He doesn't think it's simply a matter of changing my, as it were, changing things about that lie about me. This is for him, finding relief from dissatisfaction with human existence is a matter of coming to realize certain truths about us. Now, what are the four noble truths of Buddhism? They are quite simple and yet they're powerful. First of all, there is suffering. This is an undeniable fact, right? There is suffering. There is dukh. There is dukkha, as the Westerners like to call it, but I would say dukh. And this is a kind of compound, complex feeling that I'm dissatisfied, I'm thirsting, I'm grasping, I have desires. If I'm unhappy, I am dissatisfied because I want this unhappiness to end. But even if I'm happy, I'm dissatisfied because now I'm worried that my happiness is going to end, that my happiness is not enough. This is a very deep insight of the Buddha, right? That we are permanently dissatisfied even if we are happy or sad. Buddha's second insight is that this suffering has a cause. right? That there is a reason why we are unhappy. Thirdly, this cause can be identified and fixed. There is something that can be done about it. And fourthly, this is how you ease that suffering. Now, if you look at it, the Buddha is working like a doctor out here, right? He's saying there is a problem. This problem has a cause, right? Diagnosis. Then he gives us a prescription and he gives us a prognosis. You are ill. Here is the cause of the illness. Here is what you can do about it. And here is your chances. Here is the possibility of you becoming better if you follow this path, right? And there are certain failures of knowledge for the Buddha that make us unhappy. The first failure of knowledge is that everything is always changing. That the world existence is constantly in a state of dynamic flux, right? This is a very simple matter. This is absolutely, in some ways, obvious, and yet we fail to grasp it. If all things are always changing, then the Buddha asks us, why are we constantly clinging at things and expecting them to remain the change, right? Why do we cling and grasp at these things? Secondly, it is a failure to realize that everything is connected, right? This is interdependent arising. My happiness is connected to your happiness, and your happiness is connected to everybody else's happiness in the world. We are all linked. Suffering in one place means suffering everywhere else. I cannot cut myself off from this suffering, right? And I think the third and most esoteric failure of knowledge is that the Buddha pointed out that the thing that we take to be the self, right? The I, the ego, the it, what in Hindu philosophy or Indian philosophy is called the Atman. This for him it does not exist. It does not exist in the way that we take it to be. There is not some self within me that is enduring throughout my life while everything about me changes, right? But if there is no self, then who or what am I referring to when I say things like my phone, my house, my body, my daughter, right? Because these are all possessions or attributes of some thing which is self-identical with itself, right? This is a very difficult concept in Buddhism to understand. It marks one of Buddhism's most prominent departures from the Brahmanical tradition of Hinduism, which preceded it, which is committed to the existence of an Atman. When people used to talk to Buddha, when his followers would ask him, and they would say to him, "But Buddha, what will happen to me after I die?" He said that he said that question is meaningless. There is no you in some sense, which is suffering, which is being born, and which is dying. Instead, I give the name Samir or Deepak to a kind of complex of five entities, right? These five bundles, the five skandhas: consciousness, form, perception, volition, sensation. Myself, such as I understand it, is these five processes interacting dynamically over a period of time, which is constantly ever changing. There is no one Atman or one soul which is persisting through this, right? This is a very radical concept. And I would say it distinguishes Buddhism from all other traditions in some sense, which is the, the concentration on human suffering, that this is the problem in front of us. This is the thing to be, this is the thing to be solved. The Buddha has the parable of the second arrow. Existence is the first arrow, right? Somebody fires an arrow at me, it hits me in my chest, right? Now, there is an arrow in my chest. It is causing me pain. It is bleeding. I am suffering. If I start asking questions, how long is this arrow? Who fired the arrow? What is the arrow made of? How many feathers does this arrow have? This is not easing my suffering in any way. The arrow remains inside me. This was the Buddha's response to metaphysical questions. He goes, none of this has anything to do with relieving the suffering that you are feeling. We have to concentrate on relieving human suffering to pull out the first arrow and to start to fix the wound. If we all stand around discussing who fired the arrow, what is the arrow made of, We're not helping ourselves. For the Buddha, speculation about some of the metaphysical doctrines which I think he was surrounded by at his time was an invitation to simply prolong human suffering. So some ways, we call the Buddha a great psychologist, a great spiritual doctor in some ways, that he saw what the cause of human suffering was, and he went directly to that point of trying to relieve that suffering. He didn't he doesn't give us esoteric metaphysical doctrines about where we came from, where we are going, though of course there are baroque aspects of Buddhism as well. But I would say this concentration on human suffering, this, I would say, a certain kind of rigorous treatment of the problem of suffering, and I would think a very, very sophisticated treatment of human consciousness, which I would say um, modern philosophical traditions and even modern scientific traditions have now been studying for many years. I think this is what most distinguishes Buddhism as a kind of religious and philosophical doctrine.
Dr. Samir, you suggest that philosophy may not cure anxiety, but can lead to greater self-knowledge and self-acceptance. Can you give us a concrete example of how deeper self-understanding might make someone less anxious about being anxious?
Very good question, Deepak. Now, I think the remarks I made earlier in our discussion should help clarify why I think anxiety is essential and why I think reflecting on my own anxiety or our own particular anxiety can help us understand who we are and what our values are. And I think the best and most concrete example I can give is just, I can give you a kind of an autobiographical example, which is that when I reflect on my life and I reflect on why I am anxious in the way that I am, it helps me understand why I have taken certain decisions in life, why my life has the orientation that it does. And it helps me in some way reconcile myself with the kind of life I have lived. There's a kind of, dissatisfaction that we can have with our life's decisions, with the kind of life that we have lived. We might feel that we have not done enough in certain domains. But once we come to understand our own anxiety, once we come into contact with our own values and commitments, I think I have come to understand why I make certain decisions. Why have I chosen to live my life in a particular way? I have made, for instance, um, certain decisions about what to study, where to work, who to find partnership within my life, certain kinds of parenting decisions. These are not mysteries to me. My anxiety has helped me understand why I am the way I am. And it has helped me come to, I would say, some measure of acceptance of myself, right? This acceptance of oneself, right? And a certain kind of understanding that one's anxiety is, I would say, ineliminable from my life. I understood that there was no fleeing from it. So certain kinds of decisions, which I would have found very difficult, like changing careers, for instance. I made two important changes of career in my life. My anxiety or reflecting on my anxiety has, I would say, in some ways, given me the courage to make those decisions and to significantly change the course of my life's trajectory. And I would say, in a very important way, it has also helped me be the kind of parent that I am and make the kinds of parenting decisions that I make with respect to my daughter. So I would say the best and most concrete example I can give is the ways in which thinking about my anxiety has helped me understand myself better.
Professor, throughout your book, you seem to be asking readers to fundamentally reframe anxiety from something purely negative to something that carries potentially insight. What's the most important shift in perspective you hope readers take away?
I think the most important shift in perspective that I hope readers take away is something quite fundamental. We are often promised in today's culture, and we are often reassured in today's culture that we should be seeking happiness, that there is a path to happiness, and that there are solutions to happiness which I can get if I follow some prescription that somebody sells me, right? This could be a cultural prescription, this could be an economic prescription, a financial prescription, a political prescription. I think if we think about our existential conditions and we think about the inseparability of anxiety from our life, and that further helps us reflect on life, our placement within it, our challenges within it, I think we might come to fundamentally shift ourselves in what we think life is. Perhaps his life is not the pursuit of happiness. Life is not the seeking of happiness. Life is the living through of experiences, good and bad, and us hopefully finding a way to make that cluster of experiences meaningful. Whether that cluster of experiences is painful, it involves suffering, it involves some relief, we don't know. But our greatest challenge is, I would say, not to pursue happiness or not to be unhappy if I'm not able to find happiness, because I would sometimes suggest that the very pursuit of happiness can make us unhappy. I would say it is to reconcile ourselves to the challenges of existence, to the fact that existence is a series of experiences, the, the desirable quality of which cannot be guaranteed. The challenge upon me is to find a way to make my life, which might be 80%, let's say, difficulty and 20% ease, or perhaps 90% pain and 10% pleasure. The challenge is up to me is to make this experience meaningful. So I would say that anxiety can help us turn away our focus from seeking satisfaction, pleasure, or happiness into instead finding meaning and purpose in our life, and to reconciling ourselves to the fact that that meaning and purpose can be found even in an unpleasant and difficult life. One of the greatest insights that Nietzsche has offered us is that we are willing to put up with discomfort and with, I would say, an uncomfortable existence if it is meaningful for us. So our challenge is to find meaning and not to find happiness. I think the pursuit of happiness can make us unhappy. I think our constant expectation that there's some solution out there which will happily make things all fall into place, I think this itself might be a deep cause of our unhappiness. Our constant striving to eliminate anxiety could be a kind of what the Buddha calls a certain kind of grasping, a certain kind of thirsting, the tanha, that I'm always looking for something to relieve me of this dissatisfaction, right? That itself can be a deep source of our dissatisfaction. So I think reflecting on anxiety and reflecting on its place in our lives can help us shift our focus away from seeking pleasure and happiness to seeking meaning instead.
Professor, I'd like to conclude this episode with one last question. Your subtitle promises that understanding anxiety philosophically can help us live more meaningful lives. How does accepting anxiety as inevitable actually lead to greater meaning and fulfillment rather than resignation or despair?
Very good. I think it is not resignation and despair because we have understood anxiety differently. You see, by understanding something differently, by viewing it in a different light, I can come to see anxiety I can come to think about it differently. Let me go back to the example of the hole in the roof that I mentioned, right? I'm a traveler in the mountains. I'm seeking relief. I come upon a hut, right? I seek shelter in the hut. There is a hole in the roof of the hut. I'm stuck. I cannot go anywhere else. This is the only home I have. I cannot escape. I cannot fix it. So I have to spend the night in the hut. Now, if I come to understand that this is a feature of my existence and not something that I'm trying to, as it were, eliminate, I might acquire a different relationship with it. Perhaps this hole in the roof of the hut enables me to see the sky and the stars in the sky. Perhaps it enables me to see the moon, right? Perhaps it brings me into contact with an experience which I would not have had otherwise. It allows me to see myself in a different light. I think that's my best understanding, that once I come to view this thing differently, not always as a problem, but perhaps as a pathway to acceptance, I might come to think about it in a way that makes it more productive for me. I might come to understand that this constant anxiety that I have about the fate of my loved ones is a signature of my love for them. It it assures me of the importance of love. It helps me understand that even the fear of death is a kind of fear of the loss of love, that perhaps the most important thing I should be looking for in existence is not material attainment, but on securing human relationships and connections and and working to preserve the love that I have in my life. I think these are important lessons, and especially in today's culture, which is, I would say, quite caught up, as we often realize, but we still remain caught up in it in the pursuit of material gains. I think this kind of reorientation is something that anxiety can help us to understand. Resignation and despair comes about when we feel we are trapped. There is no hope. There's no way out, right? But but to come to think that this is what I have, this is what I am going to face, can force me into a different orientation with it. And I think that's a philosophical shift, that's a cognitive shift. And I think that's something that reflecting on anxiety and on our own existential conditions can help us do.
Thank you, Dr. Samir Chopra, for showing us that anxiety can be a gateway to self-knowledge rather than barrier to it. Your book and your work as a philosophical counselor offer a different kind of medicine, one rooted in understanding rather than suppression. For our listeners interested in exploring these ideas further, your book Anxiety, a Philosophical Guide is available now, and your writing can be found at samirchopra.com and in publications like The Nation and Jacobin. I would encourage anyone curious to engage with these questions yourself because, as you have shown us today, that engagement itself is a transformative. Dr. Chopra, thank you for this deeply enriching conversation. And we are deeply thoughtful with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me on, Deepak. I really enjoyed this conversation. I thought your questions were very thoughtful, and they engaged quite deeply with, I think, all the significant aspects of my book. So thanks very much for having me on.
Thank you.